legislative legal informatics space for the past 15 years. And Ashok will walk you through the specification and why courts across the world are using this standard for recording legal documents. Ashok, over to you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Ashok Hariharan, and I'm going to be talking about the Akoma Ntoso open standard. So it's not Akoma Ntoso, it's Akoma Ntoso. Just a clarification there. So just a little bit about me before we start. So I've been in the legal informatics space since 2005. I was a member of the UN project from where Akoma Ntoso originated. I am particularly interested in the XML stack of technologies, XQuery, XSLT, things like that. Also process workflow design, Lexa parsers, and front-end frameworks. I've done multiple projects internationally that make use of Akoma Ntoso. So I'm a sort of practitioner of Akoma Ntoso also. And I run a company in this space called Bungeni Consulting. So what exactly is Akoma Ntoso? So I could give you the technical explanation, but let me just start with a story so you understand the context of what exactly Akoma Ntoso is. So right now, we are all doing this conference from home because there's a pandemic out there. And one of the laws that has kicked in because of the pandemic, at least in India, is this Epidemic Diseases Act, of 1897. So mind you, this was a law passed back in 1897. And that is the law that has been used by the government, to implement various protocols. So this is the pertinent law for the moment, but it was amended. So they took this law of 1897, but they passed an ordinance in 2020. It was called the Epidemic Diseases Amendment Ordinance of 2020. And this is what it exactly does. So they had the law of 1897. They passed a new ordinance for various reasons, which we'll talk about. And what it exactly says is on line 3, in section 3, it says that we are changing the act as it was in 1897, and we are adding various other conditions to it related to harassment of doctors and so on and so forth. So and this is what it looks like. So are these just words on paper? So you had the law that was passed in 1897. You had the modern one which changed the old law of 1897. But are these really just words on paper? Not really. So just to give some background, this was 1897. That's a doctor giving some kind of treatment to somebody who got the bubonic plague in Bombay. That was the reason why the law was passed, the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. And apparently, they didn't have to use it until 2020. And this is a picture from Bombay now. All these doctors dressed in PPE gear and taking the temperature of someone. So what happened was there were doctors who were being harassed by people because they thought the doctors were carriers themselves. So they had to change the Epidemic Diseases Act because of social conditions. So they passed the ordinance, which I showed you just now. And if we consider the original Epidemic Diseases Act, as I've labeled it original, this is called the amending ordinance or the amending act, so to speak. What it has is merely instructions. This document just says that go to section 3 of the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 and add these new lines. That's exactly what it's doing. So it has instructions which allow an amended Epidemic Diseases Act to be created. So what they publish is this, and what legal drafters go and do is take these changes, like the way you do track changes in Word. They go and take the original 1897 Act, they go and type in these changes, and they apply it. And that creates the new amended Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 as changed in 2020. That is roughly, to put it crudely, that is how things happen. That is how acts get changed. So just to take a longer term perspective. I've added a picture of 2040 there. Hopefully, Mumbai is going to look like that. Let's all think positively. And so until March 2020, so I'm just rewinding back to March 2020, when this amended ordinance had not been passed. So until March 2020, the original 1897 Act was applicable. It was not the old 18, it was not, this amendment had not been passed. Then what happened in 1820? In 2020, we passed the amended Diseases Act. And from April 2020 onwards, the amended 2020 Act version is applicable until any future amendment. Yeah. So if we assume that there is a future Epidemic Diseases Act, 1897, with further amendments passed in 2040, you'll have the original 1897 Act, you'll have the amended 1897 Act as amended in 2020, and then you'll have the 2040 version. So this whole chain is called the Epidemic Diseases Act. So the Epidemic Diseases Act is not just one document, but it is all of these, the complete history of these documents. And why is that? Because all three of the laws can be applicable in 2040. I mean, if you look at the Indian legal system, sometimes cases get stuck in court. So let's say somebody went to court in January 2020, and somebody else went to court in May 2020, and the cases were they were related to the application of this act, but they went on for decades. And it'll turn out that in 2040, the new act will be applicable, but the old cases, for the old cases that happened after April 2020, this amended 1897 Act is going to be applicable, while the one prior to April 2020, the original Epidemic Diseases Act is going to be applicable. So all three versions of the law can be applicable in 2040. Many people don't realize this. Many tech people who approach the legal space, they don't realize these nuances until it's too late. So that's why I'm highlighting that. And because this idea is part of Akoma Ntoso. This core idea is part of Akoma Ntoso. The law is applicable based on its point in time. That is a key thing to keep in mind. So the key ideas and concepts are that, I'm just summarizing it here. So legislative and judicial data is very different from financial or sales data. So number one, legal data is all interconnected across time. You saw in the previous example, all three versions could be applicable at a particular time. It's also very long lasting. So in our case, it was like 100-year-old act, but it would go to hundreds of years, depending on how old the legal canon is in your country. The law is about documents. It's not records in a database, because that is how tech people approach everything, trying to normalize stuff, putting it into a database and so on. The process is legal data. So the process itself, the way the law is created, is actually pertinent data. Content, metadata, and presentation are important. I'll show you what that literally means. So all these ideas together are part of the key ideas and concepts of Akoma Ntoso. So what is Akoma Ntoso? So you had some background of laws and how they change over time and how they're impacted by different things. So Akoma Ntoso is an XML document format, much like other XML document formats which are out there, like DITA or DocBook or Open Document format or Open XML. All these are popular formats. They're used in Word, they're used in OpenOffice, they're used in archival systems and so on. Akoma Ntoso is not just a format to store laws, it's also an approach to manage legal docs and associated information. So it is a standard. I say it's a standard because it's not created by a company or or by a vendor trying to sell software. It's under a body called the OASIS Standards Body. If you Google up OASIS and standards, you'll find that This is a kind of industry organization, much like IEEE and other industrial bodies, who create standards for different sectors. So how do we pronounce Akoma Ntoso? It's Akoma Ntoso. That is the right way to pronounce it. It is means link hearts in the Akan language. That goes back to where this project began, because we were based out of Kenya in Nairobi, and that is where the project came out of. So we decided to take something from Africa. So it began with the UN. It is now with the standards body. How was this created? So it was not created out of thin air. People didn't just sit down and come up with a brand new idea on their own. No, this was built on the back of a lot of existing work done by other people, like the European Parliament, this UN Pan-African Interoperability Framework, the legal XML community. So in 2006, the UN essentially collaborated with the University of Bologna, which is the oldest legal faculty on the planet. They go back to 1088, I believe. So they're like 1,000-year-old legal faculty. As the UN, we collaborated with them, and we basically started building this legal standard. So it went through multiple iterations. It adopted different ideas from around the world. I've mentioned, took some ideas from Brazil. It took some ideas from this other project in Netherlands. Finally, in 2012, the UN decided it was not the right place for a standard. So it got handed over to this OASIS standards body, where over a 5-year period, it went through something called a standard ratification process. So it went through committees, it went with involvement of different parliaments and people in the commercial legal space. And then finally in 2017, they released Akoma Ntoso as a legal document standard. It's the only legal document standard out there. So what are legislative and judicial docs? So they cover a whole gamut of documents. These are just things I've taken out of the top of my head and put them there. But there are a couple of dozen more, or even more, because every time I see a parliament or I see some court documents, there's always a new one. In depending on the national or cultural tradition, there's a new one. So this is just a bunch of documents that came to my mind. Bills, acts, debates, amendment lists, things that typically pass through a legislature and which are required to produce a law. And these are on the right side. You will see they are legal documents coming out of courts. So who's using it? Just a quick view. You can see it's being used around the world, not by small bit players, but it's being used by the data archives in the UK. It's being used by the US House of Representatives. It's being used by the European Parliament. There's ongoing projects in FAO, and also in Spain. They have the Office of the President, who are in charge of legislation. They have a big project going on there. They have the Lex XML project in Brazil. They have the Library of Congress in Chile. Unfortunately, nothing out there in India. In India, the whole legal informatics space is really, I think it's it's at least 10 years behind the rest of the world. And not many other projects in Asia, though I've heard of initiatives in Hong Kong and in Japan. So what are all these people using Akoma Ntoso for? So I'm just going to give you a quick view. These are all the things that people are using Akoma Ntoso for: drafting legislation, publishing laws, building search engines on laws, consolidating amendments into laws. So anything surrounding the law or judgments or legality, that goes into the Akoma Ntoso bucket, and they're doing a whole variety of things with it. And who are these people? So there are different entities who find use for Akoma Ntoso. So the most typical use case are national and regional parliaments. So, for example, in India, we have the Lok Sabha, then we have the state legislatures. So those are like typical candidates for this stuff. Then there are the, different judiciaries, the Supreme Court, the high courts, even the smaller courts in your countries or places, they're all applicable candidates. International organizations and agencies, people who pass standards. These international organizations have legislative bodies with member countries who participate, and they produce standards, or they produce communiques and resolutions and so on. Those are candidates. Organizations publishing laws online, legislative and judicial monitoring organizations. Uh, they consume, they're consumers of the data, but I've seen people even creating data in Akoma Ntoso from national archives, digital libraries, commercial law data vendors. So that's the whole spectrum of players in this space. Why are these organizations using Akoma Ntoso? So just to give some reasons as to why some of these organizations are using Akoma Ntoso. So in many countries, there are transparency requirements under law. So they have access to information laws. So they have to publish their laws in machine readable formats, and to allow people and other parties to do things with it, to basically query the data. So by this, I don't mean just laws, but things like debates, parliamentary debates, who voted for what. That is actually very interesting and crucial data in many countries to see who voted for what law. And so, because then they can build a thread in terms of why are certain members of parliament voting for certain things? Are there lobby groups involved? So there's all manner of information that is extractable once you have it in an open standard. There's also shared knowledge. You can provide it essentially provides a common vocabulary to build upon, distillation of best practices. So, basically Akoma Ntoso has been built on the back of best practices. So as the standard was developed over a 10-year period, it has adopted best practices and standards from parliaments, from courts, and from other archivists, people who have been doing this for dozens of years. And it has distilled a lot of the best practices in the standard itself. And you can build skills around the standard. So if you look at different legislators and courts around the world, many of them have tried to build their own system. They think their problem is unique. They are the only people in the world to have this problem, so they went around building their own system. But then, systems need to be updated. It takes money and time. But if you have a standard, then you can build around that, and you can kind of use the common pool of like knowledge and developers and people who are around it to build it. So using a standard also lowers risk for many people. So because a standard means it has worked somewhere else for someone else. If they can Google up, they'll find a case probably, and they'll find out that other people have used it. It's also risky to build systems and design your own document formats from scratch, because laws tend to survive for very long periods of time. So you want to have a design which is robust and tested and has been built with longer periods in time. So building on top of a standard automatically reduces risk. It also lowers cost, because using a standard allows you to reuse stuff. Other people might have built systems. Other people might have built a library to work on the standard. So you can take that from the open source space and reuse it. It also provides a sharing of best practices. You can read about how somebody else implemented a whole system based on this technology, and then you can reapply. You can take their best, you can take their context and adapt it to your own context, and save time and cost. There's also a marketplace of vendors and consultants around the standard. Okay, so how are laws made? This is a graphic I pulled off the internet. It talks about how laws are made in America, but the context is applicable everywhere, because this is what happens in very many countries, including ours. And it's talking about a bill being introduced in Parliament, the bill being, going through Parliament, being debated, committee work, debate, amended, finally it becomes law. So this is the entire process that the law goes through before getting published. And this entire process is important. Legal data is interconnected. So if you saw the previous graphic, I've just distilled that into a simpler form here, as a cycle. So laws are drafted. They are drafted in parliament by people called legal drafters who talk to members of parliament, and then they go and type in their little computers there, and they produce bills. They could be amendments also. These get discussed in parliament. They get debated by members of parliament. Those debates are recorded. Then the laws are passed. They become acts. They get gazetted. Those are more official documents. Time passes. There's social changes. New pandemics and so on. And then the laws get either challenged in court, or there's an ordinance passed, or sometimes the court itself is making a judgment which is saying, we want to strike down Section 3 of that particular act and so on. So in court or in parliament, when they want to change the law, they usually debate, and they look at why did the law say what it meant? Did it mean, is what they meant actually applicable in the current context? So we need to change it. So, and then the law gets changed, and then the whole cycle goes on. So that is why we have laws from 1897, which are still applicable now because they can be amended, and they keep going through this cycle. Legal docs are also very long lasting. So this is something, again, many tech people, they don't get a handle on because they're used to solving problems in the now, and they don't think about the past. So when we were designing Akoma Ntoso, this was, so I'm from the tech background originally. And so when I first saw the laws, I thought, hey, this is a computer science problem, putting things into databases. No, it's not like that. So the laws are very old. For example, the oldest extant law now is the Statute of Marlborough, which goes back to 1267. It's a UK law. And I believe 4 chapters from this law are still applicable. I think the oldest Indian law is probably the Indian Penal Code of 1860. Maybe there are some local laws in Goa which are older than that, which are still applicable from the Portuguese era. But that is at least what I could Google up and find. So in terms of longevity, there are 2 aspects here. When people deal with legal data, they have short-term needs. So this is the problem I mentioned about tech people trying to solve problems now. So they want to use the legal data in different ways. They want to put it on an app. They want to index it with the search engine. They want to run it through document workflows. They want to consolidate the legislation, or maybe they want to classify something. So this picture here on top on the right is from the US House of Congress search engine, which allows you to search laws. And the one below is from the UAE data archive of their laws, where they've done some kind of analytics with the laws. I can't read Arabic, so I don't know what it was about, but just to give you an idea. So these are short-term needs, and the problem is many tech people tend to approach legal data from this point of view. Like, I want to solve a problem now, so let me just build a system, or let me try to store the data in the present context and see and solve the problem now. But it does not work like that, because are your laws and judgments going to be readable in 10, 20, 30, 40, or 100 years' time? So if you're going to put it into little databases, is that database going to exist? Those are questions that you really have to think. And those are questions that are being answered by Akoma Ntoso. So, and you can't rely on specific software architecture or frameworks, or even the existence of documentation in 40 years' time. So people have to be able to take your data, understand what it meant, and build systems on top of that, just on the basis of data. So that is the orientation that Akoma Ntoso takes. It's got a very long-term perspective. And in terms of long-term, it looks to the future, and it also looks to the past. So docs have to be self-expressive and self-contained. So in terms of longevity, so this is the space that it falls in. So there's short-term needs that are important, but there are also long-term challenges. So Akoma Ntoso falls into that space in the middle. It tries to enable those short-term needs, and also tries to reduce those long-term challenges. It's always there in the back of its mind. So legal docs are not records in a DB. So this is the classical problem I mentioned, so I'm a tech person. I see the law and I think, this can be normalized, act title, act date, long title, preamble, section 1. So I'll put all those into columns in a database record and I'll stuff it into a DB. Sounds great, right? So that's a great design. This is very bad in the legal space. This is not good at all. It's not predictable, because you saw one law and you thought that that is how the data structure is, but then in 2 months' time, there's some legal drafter is going to come up with another design, or there's going to be a law that you had not seen yet, but in the past, which will completely defy that structure that you imagine. So putting it into a database like that, normalized, there's no room for flexibility. The other aspect is you have to always have some kind of software to recompose the law and show it. But the problem is then if you want to render your law in 20 years' time, you're still stuck to the middleware. You'll have to call the consultant when he's 80 years old to pull out data from your system, because that's the only way you can recompose your legal document based on the middleware that the guy wrote 30 years ago. So, these are problems that Akoma Ntoso addresses. It's about self-containment. So if a law is a document, it's always stored as a document. It looks at separation of concerns, which tech people will understand very clearly, but I'll show that with an example. The content and metadata live together, but they only reference, but only to reference each other. So I'll give you an example of what that means. So for example, content, metadata, and presentation. So I said Akoma Ntoso can look into the future, but here I'm looking into the past. This is the Nalanda inscription from 860. So this is from the Nalanda, from the ruins of Nalanda. Some archaeologists pulled out this copper plate, which is a land grant given by the king to some noblemen. And it is actually a legal document. So if you look at it closely, you can break it down into a preamble, a body, and a conclusion. So this is in Sanskrit. I can't read it, but I actually read the translation. So it has clear segmentation like that, just like a law has. It has type metadata. So there's a royal decree there right on top. The king's emblem, which says it's a royal decree. It has an authority character saying, this is under the authority of King, Deva Paladeva. It has place saying where was this law passed. So Mudgagiri is the place. It has language metadata saying it's Sanskrit. So in that period, they were publishing stuff in Sanskrit and Pali. So I suspect the Pali was written on paper or palm leaf that got destroyed, and only the copper leaf one survived. And it has a date right at the end, which says year 39, day 21. Years always began with the birth of the king. So I presume that is what it's about. And then it has, so this is authentic content because it is authenticated by the king's royal seal. So much like how we put rubber stamps or we put wax seals nowadays, that is how it was authenticated. It has inline metadata. It has metadata within the content. It has names of places. It has names of people. It has designations of who these people are, to who this land is being granted to, and so on. So this is a legal document from 860, and this can be represented in Akoma Ntoso. So there is this is the content. It has presentation. So it's the presentation is basically copper plate, but the same law can be transcribed into a computer, and then the presentation becomes HTML. So you get the idea how content is separated from presentation. You can take the content and render it into a digital view, which looks like a copper plate, or you can put it into your page or your mobile and so on. And there's metadata around it, and then there's the presentation aspect. So this is a modern law. This is, the US code, one of their laws from 2011. So I've given it the same treatment. You can see, what is applicable for the 860 law is also applicable for a law from 2011. There's metadata, there's a preface, there's a body, there are sections, there are short titles. So Akoma Ntoso aims to identify and tag specific parts of the document using a standard vocabulary in a way that this information can be extracted and made sense of. So the process is also legal data. So I mentioned this earlier that the process is very important. So the process in this case is what are the circumstances surrounding a judgment or a law that was passed. We saw the circumstances that went around the Epidemic Act, where I showed you that the law was passed in 1897. There was the bubonic plague in Mumbai, and then time passed, and then there was a need to amend the law in 2020, and then the amendment was passed. But it meant that the whole chain of laws, starting in 1897 until 2020, is one work. That is, when we talk about the Epidemic Act, it means the whole body of work surrounding that, because that provides the full legal process and the full legal context surrounding that. So that would include debates which went into why was that Epidemic Act passed and so on. So here I've given an example of a judgment, which was a very interesting and pertinent judgment passed in the International Court of Justice in the 60s. So basically, Ethiopia took South Africa to court, to the International Court of Justice, saying that the apartheid policy was against human rights. And they ended up losing the case, incidentally, in 1966. And you can see there's the history of the case going, with different opinions, dissenting opinions, declarations, and so on. And there was one particular dissenting opinion from a guy called Judge Tanaka, who voted against this particular judgment. So the process, so essentially Akoma Ntoso allows you to track this kind of context to the law. So if you want to know who dissented, you can essentially query and know who dissented. Who was the person who dissented? It was a guy called Tanaka. What was his role? He was a judge. And what was his opinion? You can pull out even the structure of the opinion. So you can query different contexts. You can pull out all the opinions. You can find out what was the type of opinion. Was it dissenting? Was it in agreement? And so on. And so that's what I mean by the entire process is part of essentially legal data. There is an Akoma Ntoso community out there. If you Google up, you will find plenty of links. But essentially, just to give you a summary, so there is an annual Akoma Ntoso conference, which is held every September in Italy, which is typically hosted by the Department of Legal Informatics in the University of Bologna. And this is the place where people working in the Akoma Ntoso space, be they parliamentarians, people in the data archiving space, people in the tech space, vendors, companies operating in this space like mine, we normally go to this conference and we present what we did in the past year. We basically talk to other people who are dealing with it. There's the OASIS Technical Committee, which is dealing with the standard. There are also associated standards which are kind of related to Akoma Ntoso. So one is called Legal Rule ML, which is about putting machine-readable rules. So, rules and regulations are also covered by Akoma Ntoso. So, for example, your tax notifications, customs tax notifications. There are literally thousands of them, and they also follow the same model that you have a customs notification issued by the Indian customs body, which changes a previous notification, and that notification changes a prior one. There's always this chain of a notification changing a prior one, and that prior one changing a prior one. So that is the typical use case for Akoma Ntoso. That's what it addresses. Now people have to go through paper to find out what was applicable in my case, which is going on since 2006. So, I have to pull out the paper and see what is the connected notification, so on. So all those cases are being addressed by Akoma Ntoso and some of these associated sister standards. So there's another one called Legal Citem, which I think is still going through essentially a committee process. So which looks at standardizing legal citations. There's a public mailing list. There's the Akoma Ntoso XML mailing list on Google Groups, which has a membership of around 500 or 600, I believe. And there are people asking questions, how to use it, people doing things in Hebrew and in Arabic and in Japanese. So it's all there. So there's vendor-supported systems out there. There are commercial vendors I know who are supporting Akoma Ntoso, building solutions on it. There's a growing community of open source applications and tools. So even our company, we have published open source applications and tools. There's a site called schema.akomantoso.com, which allows you to query the schema as a learning tool. I've got a blog called akomantoso.io where I infrequently write about Akoma Ntoso. So that is essentially what Akoma Ntoso is about. That was the last slide.
Do you want to show us any websites that are already using it for people to have a look at it?
Sure. I believe the UK Data Archive is using it. Hang on. I don't have the link on me right now. Hang on. Let me just get it for you.
Thank you. But people, if you have any questions, there is the question and answer tab. You can just ask the questions down there. If you're watching it over YouTube, you can even paste your questions in the YouTube chat and we can take it over from there.
While we wait for questions, let me field mine first, Ashok.
Sure, go ahead.
Hello all, this is Prasanna. I'm a practicing lawyer in Delhi, recently qualified as an advocate on record in the Supreme Court, and I have a background in technology as well, so I wrote enterprise software for more than a decade. So I'm already sold on both the need for and the desirability of a standard in a space like this. When I first took to law, coming from a technology background, two things that struck me were that first, law was so much like code. So a project like this, a standard like this, was certainly something that I imagined would exist, would probably evolve, something that must be there. The second thing that struck me was that law was nothing like code. Right? So I was really torn between these two different kinds of thought, schools of thought, one may say. So I started both as an optimist and a skeptic at the same time for this, really. Right? In fact, to give you a couple of examples on why it is like code, in fact, there was a 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court of India in the early 70s that tried to interpret what the lists of constitution meant. So there were 3 lists under Schedule 7, which kind of delineates the powers between the state and the center. List one of Schedule 7 in the Constitution refers to all powers of Parliament as the Union legislature, and the list 2 refer to powers of the state legislature, and the list 3 refer to the concurrent power that both state and union legislatures can legislate on. So there was this question. So there was one particular entry in the list 1 that said taxes on everything except agricultural land. There is another entry in list 1 that said, that's a residual provision, it's a catch-all saying everything that is not enumerated in either of the lists is a power that belongs to Parliament. And this question of taxes on agricultural land, it was not enumerated on either of the three lists. So the question that arose before the 7 judges of that bench was, how do we interpret this? So whether we interpret this entry to say everything except agricultural land, whether this refers to an intention of the constitution makers to exclude this legislative field from Parliament's domain, or whether we should interpret the residual clause to mean that it's a catch-all anyway, and therefore it's not enumerated anywhere, it will be caught all by the residual provision. So that, in fact, they went out and said it is. So all of these three lists need to be interpreted as though they are definitions. They are not transactions. They don't confer powers. So it's very similar to code, where we have separate. We know what is an invocation and what is a definition. For instance, in a one-year employment programming language, for instance. Right? So this particular, and even in tax law, we have what are called charging provisions and what are called definitional provisions. So in many ways, our laws are like codes. In fact, our penal code is called the Penal Code, Indian Penal Code. We have a Code of Civil Procedure, Code of Criminal Procedure, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Several of them are called codes. On the other end of the spectrum, where I feel laws are anything but anything like nothing like code, is the industry that is developed around the interpreting laws. So as you said in your presentation, Ashok, when you said the whole point is to make the laws more readable, right? Readable, I presume, is more understandable. It is for the general public to know what the law is, right? Ignorance of law is no excuse. And so it is for the general public to know what the law is. But the question of what is the law is what is actually, that's the industry that is developed. All our lawyers and the judges, all of them try to discern it for the general public as to what the law is. And what is stated in the statute is just a starting point of what the law is. So I'll give you an example. Under a rent control legislation, so a landlord has a right to evict a tenant if the landlord has bona fide requirement for any residential property that he has leased out. So this phrase, residential property, was interpreted by the Supreme Court to include commercial property as well. So by a stroke of pen, the entire gamut of the meaning of the legislation got changed as to whether, because there was a specific intent only to include residential property within the purview of that particular right to evict on bona fide requirement, that was expanded to include commercial property as well. This is something that you will never know until you know the judgment that actually interpreted this phrase. And that is true of many of our laws. In fact, there are many common law jurisdictions where there are volumes produced what are called restatement of laws. Mm-hmm. What is written is just a starting point, and as you said, it is organic growth. In fact, sometimes it is growth where you don't even realize, it's completely unrecognizable from what the text is. And there are certain other problems that compound as well. I'll give another example of a recent case that I am currently litigating. In fact, we have a question of whether indentation in a provision in a statute itself means anything at all. So there's an example.
Well, that is not a surprising thing to hear. Things like indentation or drop caps. I've seen cases like that where the drop caps has a particular meaning just because somebody interpreted it to mean something in the past. You see that also with side note requirements, which are technically very challenging to render, but they become part of like standing orders or tradition of how the law is written, or they are part of a legal drafter style guide, just because they decided to write notes by hand historically on the side. Carrying that over into the text space becomes a challenge. But those are, kind of the presentation issues that are also being addressed by the standard. So one whole part of the standard is how to enable publishing on paper. So, some of the projects I've been involved in, there was one I did with FAO, which was all about being able to draft meeting documents, using Akoma Ntoso online, being able to do communal amendments, being able to do it together as a group, and then being able to render it on paper in 6 different languages in the way they had been rendered for the past 30 years. So these all seem like conflicting requirements. As I said, there is a requirement from the past and there's a requirement from the future. So it's trying to bridge both those requirements. So you'll find other cases, for example, in the US code, they refer to line numbers. Not just in the US, but you'll find that in different countries, where for historical reasons, they refer to line numbers. And the line number only has meaning on paper, that too on specific sizes of paper, but it does not carry over into the online space. So how do you cater to a requirement from the past that requires referring to line numbers on an A4 sheet or a letter size sheet, and then also support rendering that same law on iPad, or being able to compose the law on an iPad, or some kind of modern browser-based device? So those are the kind of tech challenges it tries to balance out. You want to support the past because there's a whole legal canon going back 1,000 years, which needs to be supported, and then you also want to support needs of the future. So not just from the presentation point of view, or from the drafting point of view, but also in terms of searchability, like the case you mentioned in terms of interpreting the law itself. Is this a definition? So what Akoma Ntoso allows you to do is take a law, take segments of it and say, this is a definition. So you define it semantically, you put a tag in there saying, this is a legal definition. And so it is clear, even for somebody looking at it 20 years in the future, as long as they can read English, or they can understand that this tag says definition. So this is what they meant. They meant it as a definition. So, and that's what it means. And even there is a whole context of local jurisdiction. So if you, for example, in India, there are parts of the laws called articles. You have, within articles, you have sections, I believe, if I'm not wrong. So in other countries, they could have sections as a higher level structural entity. Then within that, they can have articles. So, it's not rigid in those ways. So it tries to fit your local jurisdiction. If article is your main structural entity in your country, you can use article and you can put sections inside it. So, because 50 years in the future, the people in your country know what the law means, and they know what the article means, they know what the section means, so they're going to interpret it appropriately. So that is the whole context of it. So because a lot of times understanding what the future might be is just how the past was. So that is the kind of space it sits in.
Okay, we have some questions. Prasanna, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so my quick follow-up was that in India, at least on the question of indentation, we've not had case law on whether indentation has any role at all in interpreting what a particular proviso means. So that's something we hope to iron out in the next few years. But in the meanwhile, there are a few questions that I take. Yeah, so there's one by Mr. Jaideep, who's an advocate. The government doesn't adopt the standard. What is the path to make it workable in India, which has a huge volume of legal data generated on a daily basis? Does it depend on a body of volunteers constantly tagging and updating data?
Now, I really think this is not something that can be done by volunteers. For the simple reason that it's the government that is producing the data. The government is passing the laws, and it can be an infinite effort for the community to go and try to re-encode the law in this form when the producer is actually the government. the most efficient way is for the producer to produce it in this format. That is what they're doing in most other countries. They're producing it in this format, instead of trying to take, because I've done projects where I've taken PDF documents. Like I did a project with the ECOWAS body, which is the economic community of West African states. It's like it's kind of like the European Union, but for West African countries. And they had like 30 years worth of meeting documents and resolutions and so on. So, and they had it in PDF. So I had to convert, it was like a 7-month project where we sat and converted, 30 years worth of these legal documents into Akoma Ntoso XML. We had to write a whole bunch of DSLs, domain-specific, language processes, just to take the PDF text and convert it to Akoma Ntoso XML. It is a lot of work. So instead, if they had been drafting their laws and producing it in this format, it makes things very easy. And that is the route what it should be. But where I believe the community plays a part is essentially putting pressure on government to adopt standards and provide us data in open standards. That is what it should be. Maximum what the community can do is take specific acts and as a civic to make things easier, let's say things like the Contract Act or Traffic Act, produce like I think that is the only level that is feasible for for the wider community to do it, to take specific acts and provide, I don't know, apps or sites that allow a historical rendering of that in the context of let's say the Contract Act. You take 10 years of the Contract Act and you put all the consolidated legislation in context. So, but I think that also has commercial implications for people trying to sell services. As you mentioned, there's a whole body of lawyers and law companies who are there to interpret the law and tell you that, we have all the versions of the law and we know what that means. It's very hard to find like all the historical amendment chain for, say, the contract law in India or the Company Act. It's not there. You have to pay a vendor to get it, because on the government sites it's hidden in like dozens and dozens of PDFs. You can't find it. So that is the source of the problem. And I think the only solution is to make them do it. They have the money, they have the resources, and they are the ones who should be adopting standards. They need to have legal drafting departments who understand tech and who have some vision. If you have a vision for a country, then you should be having the laws also as part of the vision. So that's what I think. And it's not just laws; it applies to also judgments. We are not an English-speaking country, so we have regional languages. So it also applies in the regional context very much. The state laws, because for most people, it's the state laws that apply to them. The health and education laws are at the state level, most of them. So I think the linguistic context is very important here.
There are two quick follow-ups here. So one is by Jaideep himself, where he asks if, because there is going to be a huge amount of manual tagging involved, if we have to do a porting of some of the earlier laws that we have to the AKN standard. The other follow-up that I have for you, Ashok, is whether the standard itself supports this flag of whether a particular legislation has been produced in the AKN format from the source, or is it something that is backported?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of the question.
No, so the standard itself supports a flag or some kind of indication whether a particular document has been produced from the source, or whether it is a backported version of an earlier law that is produced in another form.
Okay. No, yeah, of course, so as I mentioned, let me just take you back to this slide. I didn't go too technical because I was not sure what, whether people have been exposed to this at all, but I'll just take you back to this slide. For example, can I just share my screen? So in this slide, hang on, let me just change the, yeah. So you can see that, this is the act, and there are three versions of it. There's the one of 1897, there's the one produced in 2020, and there's the future, assuming we are in 2040. So, so what Akoma Ntoso does is it follows the IFLA standards. So the IFLA is like a library body, and they have a thing called, functional requirements for bibliographic records, which basically classifies any publication in terms of, it's a work. So this entire body of three versions, the full historical chain of the act is a concept. It's not a physical document, it's a concept called the Epidemics Act. That's one level. And then it looks at it at the expression level, which is in terms of if it's produced in English and Hindi, there are two expressions of it. One is in English and one is in Hindi. So, again, that's a conceptual idea. And then there's the manifestation, which is the physical form itself. So if it was produced as XML, it would have the primary manifestation as XML. If it was produced in PDF, then the primary manifestation would be expressed as PDF. And that is fundamental metadata in an Akoma Ntoso document.
Good. The other question of Jaideep's about manual tagging that is involved, and is there any other way to work around that, or or try and minimize manual tagging as much as possible?
Yes. So there's different approaches to that. One is manual tagging. That's that's going to work it's going to work if you start from the current. Let's say you want to say, I have all the laws from now, they're going to be they're going to be drafted in the system, and all the laws from now will be drafted. So even when these projects are done, typically the now is one project of how you're going to handle the current problem. How are the laws going to be tagged from now, and the past is handled as a different project, because typically you have an older canon of legislation which needs to be tagged, and that requires different technology and a different set of skills. So the output format is the same, Akoma Ntoso, but the technology that you apply is different. So in the first case, you will have a legal drafting editor which supports Akoma Ntoso, and you would start tagging acts which are being passed now and bills that are being drafted now. You would tag them. For the past, I've done a project, as I mentioned, which took like 30 years of documents and converted that. So there's no one size fits all. It depends on the context and the structure and what probably works for you. So what I ended up doing, I looked at different technologies when I did that project. I looked at natural language processing and different things. But in the end, what really worked was just writing a DSL, at least in my case, writing a domain-specific language parser, because the thing with laws is, as you mentioned, the laws are code. So you'll find if it's there in many countries, they have a style guide as to how laws are drafted. You'll find that the preamble 9 times out of 10 will always have the same syntax. Whereas it'll start with specific phrases, having, it'll usually be in a particular case, maybe uppercase, and then when the preamble ends, it will have a particular syntax. There could be 10 different syntaxes, but you will always notice that there is a particular syntax. So if you're able to analyze the body of documents, you can possibly cover 90% or 95% of it using automated conversion. By writing custom DSLs and natural language processing, or integration of the two, you can do automated conversion of a lot of the past. And then the remaining 5% is what you handle in the regular way. You either tag it manually, or you partially tag it manually, or you write custom scripts and so on. So there's no one size fits all recipe for this, because it really depends on the nature of the laws and what format they are in. So if you look at government notifications, for example, if you look at tax notification, like if you go to the customs notifications in the Indian tax portal, you'll find that they come in very weird shapes and forms. They don't have a standard form because they are typed by some clerk sitting in an office, but they are law, because they refer to customs regulations and they get amended. And they have weird things like tables with call spans, and those kind of things. So those things are the real technical challenges. How do you convert those? So what I see people do in many countries is not they decide not to convert things like those very complex tables, because in some cases those tables were not even done on something like Word. They were done on a typeset machine. They were done in an old typeset machine with cyclostyling or whatever, and they are almost impossible. I mean, it's a cost benefit analysis. If your project has enough budget, then you convert those parts of the document into uh, into an electronic form, or you retain it as a scanned image. So like Akoma Ntoso allows you to do that. You can have a whole part of the document as XML, in the native form, and then you can have parts which are just tagged images.
Yeah, while you were at that, I have a quick follow-up, Ashok. So Delhi High Court has been, in fact, for the last about 2-3 years, has been discussing allowing judgments to have multimedia content in them, because for several of these copyright judgments, design judgments, patent judgments that they give out, it is much better, for instance, if there is super cassettes that has sued a copyright infringer, it's better to actually have the multimedia clip in the judgment. So in fact, it is being exploring. In fact, very likely in 2 or 3 years, we may have judgments that may have these binary blobs in them. So whether AKN actually envisages that, whether it supports it, whether
yes, it supports that. It's it allows you to embed any kind of media content in there. There's no limitations. And the standard has a set of tags. The standard has about 200 plus tags to support different legal contexts and things. But there's always exceptions, so because the law is always about exceptions, there's always a surprise there. So what it allows you to do is also use your own custom namespaces, so typically that's a presentation thing, so you have some kind of weird logo, or you have mathematical formulas, for example. There are laws which have mathematical formulas and equations and stuff like that. So it allows you to use any other standard if you want. So you can use MathML and embed mathematical formulas in there. There's no restrictions on that. Or you can define your own tags and do that. You can define your own proprietary tags and support that. Things like that. So.
Good. Got it. Thanks. We have 2 more questions. I think I don't think we have any more. So one is by Lawrence D. He asks, I'm just quoting his question as is, do you see any connection between this kind of formalization and the increasing use of machine learning in legal prediction? Is this a helpful connection that was foreseen by the development of AKN, or do you think the ends intended by OSS are being co-opted by commercial legal prediction firms?
Now, that's a pretty loaded question. It depends on, so you can implement machine learning systems with Akoma Ntoso. I mean, it depends on how you are tagging it. But in terms of legal prediction, I know there are ethical concerns, and I mean, there was I've seen a case where there was one particular court, one particular country's court who were embarking on an Akoma Ntoso conversion project, and one concern they had was that people would be able to take the judgment open data and be able to query the performance of judges, to be able to query and come up with stats on performance of the judges. And then subsequently, the judges could be influenced by that statistical comparison. So let's say you want to monitor the quality of judgments in a country. You could have an external monitoring organization take this whole body of judgments in Akoma Ntoso and do machine learning on it and extract meaningful information, like this particular judge consistently takes 2 months more than other judges, or this particular judge uh, issues stricter judgments for the same kind of case. Somebody stole $10,000. This judge sentenced the person for 10 years. He always seems to do that, while another judge is far more lenient. Or you could do some kind of analysis just based on the appellants and respondents, and say extract other kind of statistical information, like many of the appellants were were of a particular race or a particular religion, and their case failed. I mean, this is a hypothetical, scenario, but these are real questions. These are real ethical concerns that I've heard, over the years. And unfortunately, the standard cannot address that. The standard is about representing information semantically, and what people want to do with it is really not under what the standard is about. Because the judgment is public information, so it's up to the publisher. Do they want to publish? Do they want to strip out some data and then publish it? Those are it allows you to do that. For example, there are specific tags available in Akoma Ntoso where you want to omit names of appellants, or in the case of cases involving minors or whistleblowers, you can have specific tags where you want to strip names out. Where when the law gets published, there's an indication to the software that is publishing it that these names need to be omitted. So you can do things like that, and you can decide not to publish information which allows things, cases where judges can be compared. I think that's an implementation specific detail which the standard really cannot address.
It's a bit like trying to blame HTTP for fake news.
Yeah, I would say it is that. It's really up to the implementer and the service that is providing Akoma Ntoso or using Akoma Ntoso. It's an ethical responsibility at that end.
But generally, this is ethical concerns around judges being sort of under the standard. I think we've had, in law, we've had answers for it. For instance, the Supreme Court had resisted sort of live streaming cases for some time now, but those decks have been cleared by a judgment last year, perhaps the year before last. Although we've not had anything, live streams comments yet, but I think we will see that soon. But that's a digression. There's one last question, Ashok, of Dwiji Guru. So that is, what would a non-machine dependent form of AKM be? Essentially, the compilation of the history of each act as recorded, archived today in print, or is it something else? I don't get this question fully. Dwiji, if you're still there, if you want to ask this or clarify this question a bit more?
I think I kind of got the gist of what he's saying. So,
right.
If you look at laws historically, so the law is always printed on, like for example, I gave the case of the Nalanda, or the other case of the Statute of Marlborough. So in the olden days, laws were written on parchment or on copper plates, things which could last time. So I think the question is, in the case of Akoma Ntoso, it's all digital. It's tags, XML tags in a digital document. What is the long-term form of that? So the long-term form of that is digital, probably. So that is the idea. And the really long-term form would be would be putting the XML on parchment, maybe. I think that is, that is one way. If you want to do it semantically properly, you would etch that on parchment, long-term archival paper, something like that. You would put the XML on there so that you would be able to extract it. In the absence of any digital there, to be able to get the same semantic information out, I think that is the only way to do it.
All right, thank you very much, Ashok. This is a fascinating topic. I'm sure this is not something we've heard last of. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you very much, everybody else, for tuning in. Srinivas, the last word for you.
I have one question, I guess. So, in terms of this whole process of standardization and in terms of converting laws, whether it's from the parliament or even the judicial orders, what's missing, I guess, in India is that whole process of a standards body for digital, right? Like we don't know, for example, the standard is being ratified at OSS. In India, you have Bureau of Indian Standards for all forms of standards. But somehow these standard bodies are like MITI itself has one more, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology has one more project called the National E-Standardization Project, under which is what we got a lot of e-governance, standardization, some of it, I won't say it applies to every sector. But the question I have essentially for you is, sure, there are standards, international standards, some of which are being adopted by the Bureau of Indian Standards directly in case of ISO standards. How should one go about like getting, say, something like Akoma Ntoso or even a modified version of it for Indian courts to be, say, pushed through a standards body?
Now, so I have a very commercial view on this. So Akoma Ntoso was made to to provide legislation and judgments in terms of open data and access. But behind all that, there is also a cost motivation. So fundamentally, it's about reducing costs and being able to deliver more at a lower cost. So, the way I look at it is not even from approaching a standards body, but this should be more CTO driven, like chief technology officer driven. Unfortunately, bodies like the courts in India or even the parliaments and even the national archives and people like that, who are the custodians of these laws, they don't have that figure, I believe. I don't think they have a role called a CTO or somebody who has a vision about the data and how it's going to reduce costs and how it's going to make publication cheaper and how it's going to make access to data cheaper. So from what I've seen in other countries, it's always cost and function driven. It's rarely standards driven. That's a requirement by law in some places, but the ultimate driver is always, what can I deliver more at lower cost? That is the fundamental driver. So in the case of the courts, if you see what is the site where you can access judgment? It's probably Indian Qanun, and that is done by one person doing a project. If you think of it, a whole country like that, all the courts, they have not done anything. They could have even made money, to literally put it like that. They could have had, they have the data. They could have, taken the data, published it for the public free of charge, and also sold it to vendors who can do other things with it.
Like Pacer.
Yeah, something like that. some kind of model like that. So, but unfortunately, I don't know, that vision is not there. That data is essential for a country like ours to grow. That legal data, if it's available to everybody, it's available to more people. You don't need so many lawyers. You don't need to spend a couple of $1,000 just to fight your little case, because the law is accessible. It's online and you can get it, and more lawyers can get access to it. So the prices come down. So, I mean, I've been involved in litigation myself, and it costs me more to do litigation in India than say in Europe. So uh, it's crazy, just because you are at the mercy of the law, and the law is known only to a few, because the access to the law is available only to a few. And what is the background of the law, what is the history of the law, is not available. Nobody knows. So that is the tragedy of it. So I think it has to be function and purpose driven rather than a standard, because at least that is my belief. So
Okay, the economics of it needs to be looked into,
yeah,
and also the interest, which could be by the courts or the judiciary itself.
exactly.
As a follow-up, Srinivas, I just promised him that he can ask his question.
Sanna, you want to ask that follow-up?
I just asked him to do an oral follow-up. Vijay, are you able to hear us?
He can unmute himself and talk.
Yeah, hi. This is Dwiji here.
Hi.
Yeah, I actually did type it out. So I have to read what I typed out. Yeah, so the explanation to my question was that I was thinking beyond machines. Now, I can understand AKN makes a lot of sense when it comes to machines. But if you think beyond machines and are trying to see if it's basically an extrapolation, which is essentially about archiving. Am I right in understanding like that? And the second part to that, as an explanatory note, is that I'm trying to see if it is more about managing the various things that are possible in the digital space, which would not be possible in the print space or in the traditional space. So this is more to understand the standard and some sense map out the possibilities rather than uh, uh, like I'm trying to understand what AKN is.
So to put it simply, AKN is a format to represent your laws. So far you've been typing laws out in Word and PDF document. And while the laws are not words on paper, the laws mean something. They have a particular structure. They have a preface, they have a preamble, they have sections which have numbers, and the sections possibly have articles within them which have numbers, and the articles have paragraphs within them which are also numbered, and they refer to other legislation. So and they refer to specific versions of other legislation. So what Akoma Ntoso aims to do is to capture that, to capture the essence of that, the essence and the meaning of that, this structure, and what these references are to other legislation in terms of citations, what the numbers are, what do these numbers mean. So when you reference legislation, it's possible to reference, when you write out Article 3, Section 1, Paragraph 2, you should be able to resolve that to the exact point in the document. You should be able to have a computer, you should be able to write a program that can resolve that if you are provided an Akoma Ntoso document by using very simple logic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And in some sense, by practice, I think you just answered that it's primarily about the digital space. And that's fine. I think I'll read up more and then it will be a little more clear to me. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are at the end of the talk. It's almost 8:20. And I hope we had lots of questions. And I think Shashant Sinha, who runs Indian Kanun, was in the audience, and he shared a link of his project. I posted it in the chat. which was on what he has built on tracking loss in India. It's in the chat for anybody who wants to access, but we'll try to get him for the next talk as well. Again, thanks Ashok for explaining us with the whole Akoma Ntoso standard. And if there is anyone else who want to reach out to your poster talk, we'll get you connected to them. And I guess we'll end this talk here.